Good evening and welcome to the Truman Forum, into one of the programs at the Harry S. Truman Center for Governmental Affairs at UMKC with its partners, the Kansas City Public Library, Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, with assistance from the Bernard Haskell Lecture Fund and with the assistance of the Arts and Science and Continuing Education Department at UMKC, is happy to bring you this evening. I'm Dale Newman, Director of the Truman Center. I've abridged the resume of the speaker because I would take more time with his resume than he probably would take with his speech, and that's be fair to him, but not fair to us, I'm afraid. So here we go. Our speaker this evening is Donald Ritchie. He got his PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. He got his master's from the University of Maryland, and he got his bachelor's from City College of New York. His employment history: he's been the historian of the United States Senate since 2009. He was the Associate Historian of the Senate Historical Office from 1976 to 2009. He served on the adjunct faculty of the Cornell and Washington program, and he's been on the adjunct faculty of George Mason University, Northern Virginia Community College, and University College of University of Maryland. He's the author of 10 books. I won't read them all, but some of them are timely and of interest. Electing FDR, the New Deal Campaign of 1932, University Press of Kansas, 2007. Our Constitution, Oxford University Press, 2006, and Reporting from Washington, The History of the Washington Press Corps, Oxford University Press, 2005. And he's the editor of 7 other books, including the one he'll be sharing with us this evening, Congress and Harry S. Truman, A Conflicted Legacy, Truman State University Press, 2011, and the Oxford Handbook of Oral History, Oxford University Press, 2010. Among his many honors and awards, we find he was a distinguished alumnus, 2011 University of Maryland College of Arts and Humanities. He won the George Pendleton Prize in 2008 for the best book, Electing FDR, from the Society for History and the Federal Government. He, National Council for Social Studies, got the Notable Trade Book Award for young people for American journalists and for our Constitution. He got the Richard Leopold Prize in 1992 for Press Gallery, Congress, and the Washington Correspondence, which had been published by Harvard University Press in 1991. And he got another award for that book from the Organization of American Historians. And he got the Henry Adams Prize in 1992 for the book Press Gallery. He's held many offices in history associations, and in particular in oral history associations, which he told me earlier today is really his kind of first love, doing oral history. He's done numerous TV and radio interviews, including one just this morning on KCUR's Up to Date program with Steve Kraske. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our Legacy Series speaker, the first one in 2012, Don Ritchie. Don?
Well, thank you, Dale. I really appreciate the Truman Center's courtesy and kindness in not only inviting me here, but hosting me all day today, giving me a chance to get back to Kansas City and see the city and how much has changed in the few years since I've been here. I also want to thank Mike Devine from the Truman Library, an old friend who's not only invited me back to speak from time to time, but allowed me into his archive so I could do some research. And I've at various times had very successful trips out doing history at the Truman Library. It's a paradise for scholars because there's just so much in that material. In fact, Dale mentioned I wrote a book called Electing FDR, and in fact, the very first research that I did for that book was at the Truman Library. I had the afternoon off, and I said, well, what have you got on Herbert Hoover? And they brought out several boxes of material on Herbert Hoover, and so I actually began the book at the very end, essentially, by what happened to Herbert Hoover after when Harry Truman had become president. Well, I want to start today by talking about the President of the United States, who came to office with overwhelming public support during a difficult time, initially with firm control by his party of both houses of Congress, which enabled him to accomplish much. But over time, he faced political opposition in Congress. He became frustrated at having some of his nominations rejected, and he saw some of his legislative accomplishments stir up angry public reaction. But enough about George Washington. Today, my talk is supposed to be about presidential relations in more recent times. It's good to keep in mind, however, that presidential relations with Congress actually have been pretty strained ever since George Washington was president in 1789, and that's because the American Constitution sets up a system in which the branches of government are naturally going to be in competition with each other. 3 years ago, the Truman Library dangled in front of me an invitation to speak at a meeting they were holding in Key West at Truman's little White House. That conference was dealing with Harry Truman's relations with Congress, and they asked me if I would come down and speak. And I readily agreed for pretty much the same reason why Harry Truman spent 175 days of his presidency in Key West. It's a lovely place to be. In fact, the first speaker at that conference was former Senator George McGovern, who said that he was there because he was from South Dakota, and the only place that South Dakota was south of was North Dakota, and he accepted any invitation he could to come down to Florida. He also was there because Harry Truman went out to campaign for him in all of his campaigns, his initial campaigns in South Dakota for the House and for the Senate. At the time of that conference in 2009, the Obama administration was just coming to office. And so giving that speech gave me an opportunity to not only evaluate Harry Truman, but also it was sort of an historical exercise to look at the 10 presidents between Harry Truman and Obama to try to measure what Obama was going to be up against. And so what I did at that time was to measure each one of the presidents in terms of their congressional relations. Back then, President Obama held a number of advantages, including his victory by a very sizable margin, also the fact that his party controlled both the House and the Senate, and the fact that he had very high favorable public approval ratings. And in fact, the Senate had 60 Democrats for at least a part of his first year in office, which the press began to call a filibuster-proof Senate. And so, of course, we knew that President Obama was also laboring under significant disadvantages as well, most notably that he came to office during the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, historians, professional historians, we promise to have 20/20 hindsight, but we are absolutely myopic when it comes to predicting the future. And so I had no idea in 2009 what was going to happen next. I made some stabs at suggesting what the president's relations with Congress were likely to be. But in fact of the matter is things have developed in very unsurprising ways since 2009. And so really a large part of my discussion tonight is going to be looking not only at this relationship between Congress and the presidency from Truman to Obama, but also looking at how President Obama's relations with Congress have changed over the course of his term. When historians try to rank presidents, we're always up against sort of the public opinion poll. Is this a beauty pageant type of ranking? Or how do you actually decide one president is greater than another president? And there's certainly been lots of attempts. Arthur Schlesinger has had several attempts that he's published. And actually, Arthur Schlesinger Sr. published the first presidential poll. But in 2009, as I was giving that earlier speech, I had a great advantage, and that is that C-SPAN had just conducted a poll of the political scientists and historians and journalists who had appeared on the program. And they decided to try to go beyond just the popularity of the president with the historians. They actually had us break down all of the presidents into various categories, one of which was their congressional relations. And then at the end, they added up how well they did in those categories. It was a very interesting experience. For instance, it was hard to judge George Washington high in terms of human rights, considering that he owned slaves. And that actually bumped George Washington down in our poll and made Abraham Lincoln our number one candidate. And there were a number of other places in which you had to decide what qualities a president brought to office. The fact is that Harry Truman did very well on the C-SPAN poll. He ranked 5th out of all of the presidents of the United States. But he only ranked 16th in the category of congressional relations, and that put him behind many of his successors to the presidency. And I think the chief reason for that is that most of us who were responding to that poll were thinking about Truman's relations with the Republican 80th Congress. That's what is the most famous period of Truman's presidency. And the fact that he went on to campaign against a do-nothing Congress in 1948. Of course, actually, the 80th Congress wasn't really a do-nothing Congress. It was a Congress that did what it wanted to do, which wasn't what Truman had asked it to do. But in fact, the 80th Congress had accomplished passing, for instance, the Taft-Hartley Act over Truman's veto. That Congress, however, did not address a number of liberal reforms that President Truman had asked for, like universal health care. And it also didn't even address a number of the issues that were in the Republican platform in 1948, which was Truman's justification for calling them back into special session in 1948. And then when they failed to respond to his demand that they actually enact their own platform, that gave him a campaign platform, essentially, to run against Congress. It's interesting, however, that Truman actually was very successful in his relations with the 80th Congress in foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy. And in that sense, as one historian put it, Truman was very successful where he wanted to be. And he managed to get a great deal of bipartisan political support for his international programs at the beginning of the Cold War, setting in place a number of programs that, in fact, would last, and a strategy for dealing with the Cold War that would last until the end of the war, when the wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed. So despite the fact that Truman was actually very successful in dealing with Congress in those areas, his campaign was against Congress, and to everyone's surprise, of course, not only did he win re-election in 1948, but the Democrats took back majorities in both the House and the Senate. Unfortunately, Truman's programs didn't turn out to be any more successful in Congress when he had a Democratic Congress after 1949 than it did while he was dealing with a Republican Congress. And this is the paradox of this Truman's era. Political scientists are very good at giving labels, and we historians appreciate all the work that political scientists do because they help us to categorize periods. And political scientists have described the Congress during the era of Harry Truman as a, quote, bipartisan conservative era. This was an era that began in 1937 when President Roosevelt tried to change the way the Supreme Court was structured because he objected to the fact that the Supreme Court was turning down so many of his programs. He tried to increase the size of the Supreme Court. His opponents said he was trying to pack the court. And what that did was to split the Democratic ranks in Congress so that the conservative Democrats who opposed him on the court plan sided with Republicans in voting. And that coalition, that conservative coalition that started in 1937, prevailed all during Harry Truman's administration. And in fact, it persisted until 1964. So that conservative bipartisan era existed during the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy years. And it finally ended with the filibuster against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Breaking that filibuster, together with Lyndon Johnson's landslide election in 1964, began a new era in Congress, and this era political scientists have called a bipartisan liberal era, or a bipartisan liberal Congress. And during that era, the liberal Democrats' ranks increased considerably, and they voted with moderate to liberal Republican senators and representatives to enact President Johnson's program in the 1960s. And in fact, the bipartisan liberal Congress continued during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, and finally came apart when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and the first Republican majority was elected in the Senate in 26 years. Democrats still held on to their majority in the House of Representatives, and they would do that for another 14 years after the 1980 election. Now, the period since 1980 has more often than not been marked by periods in which a president of the United States faced a Congress in which the opposition party controlled at least one, sometimes both, houses of Congress. Political scientists have not been as good about finding an acceptable label for this era. They've tried several, and I've noticed that divided government and gridlock are often in the titles of those eras. So let me start with the bipartisan conservative era, which was Harry Truman's era. Now, one thing that distinguished Harry Truman from a lot of the other presidents in that C-SPAN poll is that Truman actually asked Congress to do a lot more than many other presidents did. And and certainly he asked them to do a lot more than some of the presidents who scored higher than he did on the C-SPAN poll. And so it makes a question as to whether or not we should reward presidents by not asking Congress to do enough, essentially. But Truman certainly had a very ambitious program. He became president in April of 1945. His initial reaction, of course, coming into the presidency was to win the war, and the war in Europe and in Asia was still going on. But once the war had ended in the summer of 1945, Truman turned around to look at what was going to be his domestic program. And at the end of September 1945, he sent what was essentially his first State of the Union message to Congress. Unfortunately, it was such a long message, he chose not to go to Congress to read it. And that, I think, might have been a mistake, but it was, in fact, a very impressive set of proposals, 21 different proposals for legislation, everything from full employment to housing to universal health coverage. Very little of it was ever enacted into law during his presidency. Members of Congress actually liked Harry Truman quite a bit, and Truman himself said he spent the 10 happiest years of his life as a senator from Missouri. He maintained very good personal relations with many of the leaders of the Senate and the House, and he and his cabinet secretaries handled the big legislative issues themselves, personal dealings, personal relationships with members in Congress. When it came to Truman's second term, however, he realized that there was an awful lot of responsibility in dealing with Congress on a day-to-day basis that he just didn't have enough time to do. And it's really Harry Truman who's the first president of the United States to appoint congressional liaisons. He picked a Navy liaison by the name of Joe Feeney and an Army liaison by the name of Charles Malon to handle sort of the day-to-day, on-the-Hill relations, what this congressman wants and needs, and back and forth, a little twisting of arms and checking on the pulse of Congress. This was actually a pioneering effort. No president had done this before. But actually, Feeney and Malon was so far down the totem pole in the Truman administration that Truman never even mentioned them in his memoirs. So it's his Republican successor, Dwight Eisenhower, who gets the credit for establishing the first formal White House Congressional Liaison Office. Now, Ike had some experience in this. The military, of course, always had congressional liaisons out on the Hill because the military appropriations bill had to be argued out every year. And back in the early 1930s, when General MacArthur was the Army Chief of Staff, Dwight Eisenhower was his chief aide, and it was Eisenhower who would go up to Capitol Hill to talk to the leaders of the Appropriations Committee on the Senate and House to get the Army appropriations. The Army only had one car in those days, and General MacArthur wouldn't let Eisenhower use it. So Eisenhower had to take the streetcar up from the White House up to Capitol Hill. But he knew what congressional liaison was all about. And when Eisenhower himself became Chief of Staff during the Truman administration, he had military officers who were handling that same type of congressional liaison. And as the Army's military liaison at that time was Major General Wilton Parsons, better known as Jerry Parsons. So it was very natural when Eisenhower became president that he brought in General Parsons to become his congressional liaison. And it was also very telling that the first thing that General Parsons tried to do was to hire Harry Truman's congressional liaisons to stay on the job to be Eisenhower's. But they were quite so burned out by that, neither one of them wanted to continue. And in fact, they turned to another Democrat on Capitol Hill, a man by the name of Bryce Harlow, who became General Parsons' second in command and eventually took over and is really, in the history of White House congressional liaisons, Bryce Harlow is sort of the granddaddy of them all. He's the one who set up much of the programs and the ways in which other presidents have followed. So Parsons and Harlow actually gave President Eisenhower really good relations with the leadership in Congress. But they had a really peculiar situation. General Eisenhower was a centrist. He was so centrist that the Democrats had actually considered running him for president in 1948 when they didn't think that Truman had a chance of being reelected again. And when he came into office, his chief concern was to continue internationalist foreign policies, which were very unpopular with the isolationist wing of his own party, including some of his own congressional leaders. So Eisenhower essentially made a deal with congressional Democrats that if they supported him on foreign policy issues, he would not move to dismantle the New Deal and the Fair Deal programs that have been built up over the years. In fact, Eisenhower as president expanded programs like Social Security. So Eisenhower got what he asked for from Congress for the most part, but he didn't ask for anything near as much or as ambitious as what Truman had asked for. The other amusing part of the Eisenhower congressional relations is that actually Eisenhower saw congressional leaders a lot more than ever appeared in the press, because his congressional liaisons didn't want to let it out that President Eisenhower was meeting with the leaders of the House and the Senate, because he was quite often meeting with the Democratic leaders of the House and the Senate, Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, who he got along fine with. And they didn't want the Republican leaders of the House and Senate to know that the president was not inviting them as often to the White House at that time. But as a result, Eisenhower stands below Truman in the overall C-SPAN poll, but he actually ranks above him in terms of congressional relations. Now, a member of Congress during both the Truman and the Eisenhower administration was elected in 1960 to succeed Eisenhower, and that was John Kennedy, President Kennedy felt that neither President Truman nor President Eisenhower had devoted enough attention to congressional relations. And he complained that he could not recall either Truman or Eisenhower or their staffs ever saying one word to him about legislation during the years that he served in the House and the Senate. Kennedy planned to change that as president. He planned to be a much more active president. He appointed a very savvy congressional liaison, Larry O'Brien. And President Kennedy was a charming man, and every account by members of Congress was that everybody liked him personally. And as a result, he held lots of meetings with members of Congress. His congressional liaisons believed that he met over 2,000 times in his first year with individual members of Congress, trying to persuade them to support his programs. And yet, President Kennedy's record with Congress was pretty disappointing. He got much less passed than what he asked for. Kennedy took, I think, a pragmatic view of this. He said that if he had asked Congress to do less, they would have passed only half as much as what they did. So he felt pleased that he'd gotten as much done as he did, and of course he always expected that he was going to get much more passed in his second term. So the conundrum is, why is it that a Democratic president like John Kennedy got so little support from Congress when the Democrats were the overwhelming party in both houses of Congress? And the fact is that the political parties that existed in the era of John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman are very different from the political parties that have existed in the era of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama. The parties have changed drastically in the intervening years. From the 1940s, in the Truman era, up through the 1960s, both political parties were internally divided. Both parties had a liberal wing and a conservative wing. There was the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party as opposed to the Taft or the Barry Goldwater wing, the conservative wing of the party. And in that era, there were some Republicans, like New York Senator Jacob Javits, who actually had a more liberal voting than most of the Democrats in the Congress. And there were some Democrats, like Mississippi's James Eastland, who had a more conservative voting record than most of the Republicans in Congress at the time. Nobody ever expected that there would be a straight party line vote on anything. Nobody could imagine that Jacob Javits and Barry Goldwater would vote the same way on any particular issue. Nor could they ever imagine that James Eastland and Hubert Humphrey would ever vote the same way. Instead, it was the Humphreys and the Javitses who voted together against the Goldwaters and the Eastlands. That's why we call that era the bipartisan era. There was always a bipartisan vote. There was never a party line vote on anything. If there had been a party line vote in the 1960s, it would have made the front page of the newspapers. It would have been so unusual. Political scientists back then lamented that there were really 4 parties in Congress. And the political scientist James McGregor Burns wrote a book about this in which he described the conservative coalition that dominated Congress as the Congressional Party, while the liberal coalition that voted against them he called the Presidential Party. And he basically said that the Congressional Party was hostile to major government trends since the New Deal, and that they applied a brake to any major government trends and programs that were being proposed, any new expansion of the federal welfare programs. And because that conservative coalition included the chairman of most of the powerful committees in the House and the Senate, they were able to bottle up a lot of that president's, Truman's, and even Eisenhower and Kennedy's programs at that time. In fact, for instance, education. The Education Act in the 1950s was passed 3 times by the Senate, but not by the House. And it was only the fact that Sputnik went up that frightened the House of Representatives into passing an education bill that had the word defense in the title. And that's how we got the National Defense Education Act. But otherwise, there was great resistance to federal aid to education at the time. So the conservative coalition that dominated Congress especially frustrated Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy. The consequences of this 4-party system, McGregor Burns pointed out, was that presidents and other political leaders had to contend with multi-party coalitions, which often shifted according to this particular issue or that particular issue. You essentially had to renegotiate every time there was a bill up to try to figure out how you could get enough votes, bring in your side, and get enough people from the center on this particular issue who'd come together on this issue, even though they wouldn't stand together on the next issue that was dealing with. Now, the 4-party system provided flexibility, and it provided accessibility and representation, essentially, for the whole American political system. Everybody got heard in this process. But McGregor Burns, while he conceded that, said that this was at the expense of leadership, vigor, speed, and effective and comprehensive national action. So those who wanted a stronger, more effective national government lamented the fact that the political parties were so divided on Capitol Hill. And political theorists were looking for some kind of a political realignment that would create an effective 2-party system with internally unified majority party dominating the political system. This is assuming that the president was of the same party as this majority in Congress. This would ensure what McGregor Burns called responsible, committed, effective, and exuberant leadership. As they say, beware of what you wish for, because you might actually get it. Now, McGregor Burns' book was released, The Deadlock of Democracy, was released in 1963. In the spring of 1963, it got very favorable reviews. It even made the New York Times bestseller list that year. And then in November of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated, and the former Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson, became president. And during the next year, Johnson steered the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through a protracted filibuster, got it into law, won a landslide re-election, and carried a mass of liberal Democrats into the House in his re-election. And that, of course, led to the Johnson's Great Society programs, a very efficient, fast. Well, the old-time staff that I've interviewed described that period as whoosh, as bills just sort of rushed through the Senate and the House. To the point that only a year after it had been published, James McGregor Burns' Deadlock of Democracy was being described by political scientists and historians as a, quote, brilliantly wrong-headed book. There had been no deadlock, they said, just a lack of sufficiently strong leadership. And that Burns was mistaken in painting Congress as an obstructionist villain. The journalist William S. White wrote that, quote, if a president is strong with the people, if his programs seem to them to be in their interest, and if his relationship with Congress is mutually productive, the net of all of that is that Congress becomes a good guy. And so Congress in the mid-1960s now is the good guy in the process. This is the beginning of this era that is known as the Bipartisan Liberal Congress. And by the way, Robert Caro is just about to publish his next volume of his Lyndon Johnson biography, which will take Johnson from 1960 to 1964, which is a really pivotal period, and I'm sure everybody's looking forward to that edition. There's also a wonderful book that's just been published this week called The Last Great Senate by Ira Shapiro, and it's about the Senate in the 1970s, but it's the end of that bipartisan liberal era. So on the C-SPAN poll, Lyndon Johnson ranked second to FDR in congressional relations, although he ranked a lot lower in the overall qualities. Now, he was a former member of the House, a former senator, a former Senate Majority Leader. He was essentially his own congressional liaison, and he had a hands-on approach to running Congress that was quite remarkable. Lyndon Johnson, when I say hands-on, it really was hands-on. His hands were on your lapels, on your hand, on your shoulder, here and there. Barry Goldwater once said that Lyndon Johnson was the only man who breathed into your mouth when he was talking to you. And it was a very physical presence. It was very hard for people to turn him down along the way. And Johnson also knew where bills were in committee. I talked to a person who worked in congressional liaison in the Nixon White House. He said he couldn't imagine working for a president who knew where a bill was in a subcommittee or cared where the bill was in a subcommittee. But Johnson knew even ahead of his congressional liaison. He'd be calling them up and telling them what they needed to do. Of course, Johnson also benefited by the fact that his election in 1964 vastly increased the size of the number of Democrats in the House, particularly liberal Democrats. Larry O'Brien said that, quote, for all practical purposes, Medicare was enacted on Election Day 1964 because enough new members of the House were elected who supported Medicare, and that program, which had been stalled for many years in Congress, was finally enacted. Liberal Democrats had won big victories in 1958, 1964, and liberal Republicans won a pretty big victory in the congressional elections of 1966 following the disastrous Goldwater campaign of 64. And so that's the coalition of Republicans and Democrats that became known as the Bipartisan Liberal Congress. And this was an era in which legislative reformers began to trim the power of the committee chairman and to reduce the Senate's cloture motions. People say, why does it take 60 votes to do anything in the Senate? I say, you don't understand, that was the reform. It used to take 67 votes to do anything. In 1975, they got it down to 60 votes, and they thought that that would help to make things move more expeditiously. The legislative direction of Congress changed so sharply in this era that even Richard Nixon wound up racking up a pretty liberal legislative record. President Nixon was far more interested in foreign policy than in domestic issues, but he was also keen to keep out ahead of Congress on popular issues like clean air and clean water. And he signed quite a bit of legislation that we consider to be, great accomplishments of Congress in that era. Nixon was the first president to come to office in a century not to have either House of Congress have a majority of his own party. But the Congress that was there, that liberal bipartisan Congress, is the Congress that James McGregor Burns called the presidential party. And it was ready to support President Nixon as it would support other presidents having ambitious agendas at that time. And this is why Nixon actually, I think Nixon gets a poor deal in the C-SPAN poll because he ranks so low in his congressional relations. But if you actually look at it, Nixon had a pretty good rate. During his first year, without either one of his houses of Congress being controlled by his party, he won 74% of the time on roll call votes for things he asked. Of course, we know by the end of his administration, because of the Watergate scandal, he was down to a 43% approval, and Congress was actually passing a lot over his vetoes at that time. Richard Nixon scored lowest in the C-SPAN polls on congressional relations and, quote, moral authority. Those are two categories that his hand-picked successor, Gerald Ford, actually scored much higher. But Gerald Ford's presidency is also a paradox. He had spent his entire adult career in the House of Representatives before he was surprisingly thrust into the vice presidency and then into the presidency. His great aspiration in life was to become Speaker of the House. And you would think that having spent so much time working with Congress and actually being the congressional choice for vice president, Nixon had actually wanted to appoint John Connally as vice president, and Congress said they would never confirm Connally, and they talked him into taking Gerald Ford. You think with that kind of good relations, a lot the way that Harry Truman had good relations when he came into office, that Ford would have been a more effective president. But, you know, if Lyndon Johnson was a super majority leader as president, Gerald Ford was a sort of a super minority leader as president. He'd been a minority leader all during his time in the House. He was resigned to fighting losing battles. He was convinced by his staff that he would look stronger as president if he vetoed a lot of legislation. In fact, Gerald Ford vetoes more legislation than any other president until you get back to Harry Truman, who was also up against a Congress that he was opposed to in vetoing legislation. So there really was not a great deal of cooperation between Congress and Ford during his presidency. When Gerald Ford lost in 1976, the Democrats were very hopeful that they now had a Democratic president who was going to work with their strong majorities in both houses. Unfortunately, the Democrats had elected a person who'd campaigned as an outsider, not as a Washington insider. And Jimmy Carter was quite determined to set his independent course and not necessarily to follow what Congress was looking for. Carter had an ambitious program. It just wasn't the program that Congress was interested in at that point. On the C-SPAN poll, Jimmy Carter ranked 32nd in congressional relations. And I don't think his track record was quite that bad, but Carter had this habit of whenever he proposed something, it was always comprehensive. All his bills were comprehensive bills. And he would get 90% of what he asked for. And he would bemoan that he didn't get 100% of what he asked for and treat it as a loss that he hadn't gotten everything that he wanted. Very different from Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's training wasn't just as a movie actor, and it wasn't just as governor of California. Ronald Reagan is the only labor union president ever to be elected president of the United States. Ronald Reagan had negotiated contracts. He knew how you did this. You asked for the sun, the moon, the stars, and you got about 50% of what you asked for, and you declared it a great victory. You went back to your side and you said, we won. Even though, in fact, the matter is you'd only gotten about half of what you wanted. So, you know, in many ways, Carter got more than what he wanted, but he got less credit for what he did. And unfortunately, his self-admitted defeats contributed to an image, I think, of him as inept in his relations with Congress. In his memoirs, Jimmy Carter attributed his problems with asking Congress to do too much, too soon. But from a congressional perspective, it wasn't a problem of volume, but the problem that the programs he was asking for were out of step with what the sentiments in Congress were at the time. The 1970s were a period of remarkable political change, and in fact, it's a period that is now being studied very extensively by historians and others because that's when the records are now beginning to open up, and we can see what was happening behind the scenes. And there's the big question that the historians who are dealing with this era are asking is, were the 1970s pointing towards the conservative reaction of the 1980s, or was public opinion up for grab during the 1970s? Would things have been different if Senator Ted Kennedy had beaten Carter for the Democratic nomination in 1980? Would things have been different if the Iranian hostage crisis hadn't happened? Would things have been different if Carter had actually had worked more effectively with Congress? But that's counterfactual, and we know, of course, that Carter lost that election. Ronald Reagan comes in. Reagan's coattails are sufficient to bring in enough members of his party in the Senate to have the first Republican Senate in 26 years. Even though the House would stay Democratic, its margins were much thinner. And Reagan's time corresponds to a massive political change that's going on. When historians look back in the future on our era, one of the things that's going to stand out the most is the dramatic shift in the South in our political landscape. When Harry Truman was president, there were no Republican senators really from the south of the Mason-Dixon line. There were a handful of Republicans in the House, It was a rare occasion for a Republican to be elected in the southern state. They called the South the Solid South, and it was solid Democratic. It had begun to change in 1948 when Strom Thurmond led the Dixiecrat walkout, the Democratic Convention. It began to change in 1961 when John Tower was elected to Lyndon Johnson's Senate seat. And it began to change also in 1964 when Strom Thurmond switched party affiliation and became a Republican in South Carolina. But it didn't happen overnight. It took a long time. And as late as the 1970s, most of the Southern senators were still fairly conservative Southern Democrats. The 1980s, however, saw the change. And a lot of the Southerners who got elected with Ronald Reagan in 1980 were actually transplanted Midwesterners. A lot of these Southern senators were born in Indiana and in Illinois, and they reflected the population shifts of people moving into the Sun Belt. And the South also, after civil rights was no longer an issue, South was always a conservative part of the country. It began to gravitate towards the Republican Party as the more naturally conservative party. So what we have now is that every southern state, Louisiana was the last state to finally elect a Republican senator, but every Republican state, every southern state has elected Republicans in the last generation. And in the current Congress, for instance, in the United States Senate, of the 11 former Confederate states, there are 16 Republican senators and 6 Democratic senators. So the Solid South is no more. One of the traditions of the Senate is that incoming senators get the same telephone number as the person they replaced. And I've done an oral history with a staff member who has worked for 4 senators from his state, 3 Democrats and currently a Republican. And he points out that he's had the same telephone number the entire time that he's worked there. He's just worked for each person who's gotten elected to that state. And he actually points out that the voting records of the senators that he's voted for are pretty much the same, that many of the Republicans who are serving today are voting very much the way the Democrats who held their seats did years ago. For instance, in Georgia, the 2 Georgia senators today are likely to vote pretty much the same way that Richard Russell and Herman Talmadge would back in the 1960s, except that they no longer champion segregation. So they even have the same committees. You can find out that the Georgia senators today are usually on the Agriculture Committee and the Armed Services Committee, which were important to the South back then and important to the South today. So is there any difference in the fact that these senators, in the fact that they vote the same way, is there really any difference in the way they operate in the Senate and their relations to presidents? Well, there is one, I would say, and that is on issues that mattered to them, these conservative Southern Democrats were quite willing to vote against their party and against their president. But on other issues that were not as important, they were quite willing to go along with their party's leadership in Congress, what their members wanted, because quite frankly, it wasn't in their interest to embarrass the National Democratic Party or the Democrats in the Senate, because they wanted the Democrats to retain the majority so they could be chairman of the committees. So they limited their levels of obstruction to what was going on. The new Southern senators are now in the opposition party, and they don't see a lot of advantage in cooperating with the majority party. Their objective, in fact, is to turn the majority party into the minority party so they can become the majority party. And so you see a lot more overt political warfare going on in Congress today than there was back in the days of that 4-party system, because there were all these complex relationships that relate to the fact that people of such different ideologies were existing in the same political party. So I think this is the biggest single difference. If Harry Truman came back and walked through the Senate today, there's a lot he would find that would be very similar to what he knew in the 1930s and the 1940s. But he would be absolutely flabbergasted to look at the people who are the senators from most of the southern states and to realize how different the political system had come over the years. So this shift, this huge shift, had a big advantage to Ronald Reagan. And it helped Reagan score some really impressive legislative victories, including his famous tax cuts in 1981. Reagan also was one of the few presidents, his congressional liaison said it was a really remarkable thing to work with a president who actually liked working with Congress. And he had a a system of diffusing the politics. And he and Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, had an agreement that after 6 o'clock at night, politics ended and they could have a drink together. And Reagan used to call O'Neill up in the middle of the afternoon and say, "Tip, is it 6 o'clock yet?" And it was a nice device for building relationships. So Reagan overall came in 10th in the C-SPAN poll, but he came in 8th in congressional relations. Reagan's popularity helped his vice president, George H.W. Bush, win the presidency in 1988, but Bush also inherited all of the deficits that Reagan's tax cuts had caused. And this created a problem for his administration because he started out by promising to read his lips, no new taxes, and then it became pretty clear that to try to end the deficit problem, he was going to have to raise taxes. It wasn't the Democrats who sabotaged Bush, it was the House Republicans led by Newt Gingrich, who rebelled, walked out, voted against Bush's tax plan, made Bush look weak in the middle of an economic recession, and led to his defeat in 1992, which opened the door for a Democrat, Bill Clinton, to come in. Now, like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton came to office with strong Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. He had also campaigned on promising to bring about more bipartisanship, and he thought he could do this, but of course he found bipartisanship sorely lacking in Washington at that time. Newt Gingrich, who was leading the Republicans, really was trying to get them back into the majority. They'd been in the minority at that point for 38 years. And so Gingrich just adopted a policy which I've heard him say was politics is warfare without bloodshed. And in warfare, you really don't give a lot to the other side. So House Republicans forced Clinton to work with his own party, and that started off his presidency in a very much more partisan manner than he expected. The lines grew very tight over time. And of course, Clinton fails, notably in enacting the health care bill that he spent so much time in his first 2 years in trying to put into law. Curiously, Bill Clinton's congressional relations improved, and his presidency looked stronger as his congressional relations got weaker. And once he pitted himself against Congress, Clinton came out ahead on a lot of issues. You remember in 1995, the federal government shut down, and the public blamed the Congress, not the president, for that. And Clinton's standing went up because Clinton was willing not to sign, and in many cases to veto, legislation that he felt was weakening the federal structure. I know this from sort of personal experience. As my wife works for the National Gallery of Art, and I drop her off there every morning. And in 1995, there was a Vermeer exhibit at the National Gallery. And people would be lined up in the snow around the building at 8 o'clock in the morning when we were arriving. The museum was not going to open until 10 o'clock. So these were really serious art fans who were out there. And when the federal government shut down, so did the National Gallery of Art. And the Vermeer exhibit was off limits. And it was the first time members of Congress heard from their constituents over art. And people saying, this is outrageous. Museums that we go to, parks that we go to, everything's closed. You know, we didn't send you to shut down the government. We sent you there to improve the government. And so, in fact, Clinton did much better in the process. I don't think that is reflected in in the C-SPAN poll, perhaps because he was impeached in his second term. But he has an overall standing of 15 on the C-SPAN poll, but 19th in congressional relations. Those are, however, higher levels than George W. Bush gets. George W. Bush ranked 36th out of 44 presidents on the C-SPAN poll, and the Gallup poll at the same time showed that a majority of Americans believed that history would remember his presidency as, quote, below average. But George Bush has cautioned us not to misunderestimate him. And in fact, despite the fact that when he came to office, the Senate was divided 50-50, and in fact, the Democrats actually got the majority when Senator Jeffords crossed the line midway through that Congress. Despite the fact that he had not a great command of what was going on in Congress, Bush got the tax cut he'd asked for, he got 2 war resolutions, he got education reform, and he got a prescription drug benefit for seniors. Now, there is a trade-off, of course, for this, and that is he looked the other way when Congress was engaging in earmarks. which led to the eventual scandal over the bridge to nowhere. During his first 6 years as president, George W. Bush did not veto a single bill that came out of Congress. So Congress was giving Bush what he wanted, but Bush was also giving Congress what he wanted at the time. And then when the economy collapsed at the end of his presidency, he and his party bore a lot of the blame for it at the time. And that helped to elect Barack Obama. So now we come to President Obama, who took office with very high standings in the public opinion polls, both houses of Congress controlled by his party, and a sense of national crisis to propel his legislative agenda. Congress actually works most efficiently in times of crisis. The depth of the Depression, right after September 11th, Congress comes together. They see an emergency, they put aside partisanship, and they get something done. They can act remarkably quickly under those circumstances. And so you would think that the recession in 2009 would have brought people together. President Obama, by nature, is a synthesizer. He had promised in his campaign that he would try to move beyond the sort of divided government and polarized government and to bring back a spirit of bipartisanship. But all of that proved much more elusive than he anticipated, in part because his party had such large majorities. The minority party was very afraid of being steamrollered. They were just going to be ignored, and they weren't going to have a voice in this. And so the minority party's strategy was to say, okay, you won. This is your crisis. You're in charge, but don't expect us to help. President Obama went to speak to the House Republican Conference in 2009 to get them to support his stimulus bill. And the next day, not a single Republican in the House voted for the stimulus bill. So it was pretty clear that if the president was going to get anything, it was going to have to be through his own party conference. And that meant that you were going to have to negotiate between the wings of your party to get something done. And that gave an enormous amount of clout to the more moderate to conservative members of the Democratic Conference, who were able to veto the idea of a public option, for instance, which the House and the President had supported on the health care bill. But they did pass a health care bill, something of a lesser health care bill than the President had originally asked for in the process. But that was because that was the only strategy that was essentially available to the majority party at the time. The other problem was that, you may remember, when Senator Kennedy's seat became vacant, they elected a Republican to fill it. And that meant that the Democrats had 59 votes instead of that magic 60. And so to get one more Republican on side, the trouble was you needed one more, but who wants to be the 60th vote? Nobody. Nobody wanted to stick their neck out. You had to get 2 or 3 more to come over on a particular issue, so there was a little bit of safety in number. And that meant even more compromising that was going on. It was left very little room for negotiation. So what we have in Congress right now is something that resembles what is commonplace in most parliaments, and that is the two political parties are internally united. They're cohesive. They think alike. They just think differently from the other political party. And their votes are very consistent. It's quite remarkable. All those votes we take today are almost all party line votes. Remember I said when Harry Truman was president, there never was a party line vote. Today, it's rare to have a bipartisan vote. In fact, if 1 or 2 senators vote with the other party, they call that a bipartisan vote today. It's just the way the system has evolved. The question is the public that divided, or are the politicians that divided? Do we, the people, want those 2 poles, or have the politicians sort of separated into 2 camps because that's the way they get themselves elected? And the fact is both parties essentially have driven the moderates out, so that moderates and non-mainstream people in both parties have gotten defeated in the polls and have so the 2 parties are pretty well set in their territory at this stage of the game. And that has complicated greatly the deal for both the leader of the president and for the leadership in Congress, this homogeneity. As I say, beware of what you ask for because you might actually get it. So it's not the institution of the Senate that's changed or the House that's changed. What's changed are the 2 political parties. This has made it much more difficult for the presidents in recent years. And when you consider that the last 5 presidents of the United States have faced, at least during some part of their presidency, a majority in one or the other house or both houses of Congress. This is a very difficult situation, probably a more difficult situation than presidents of Harry Truman's period. So what lessons have we learned from these experiences, from Truman to Obama? One is that if you previously served in Congress, it's not necessarily a ticket towards great congressional relations. John Kennedy and Gerald Ford, who spent their entire careers in Congress, didn't have as good congressional relations as Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan, who had never served in Congress, for instance. Sometimes it's just the luck of the draw and the particular times that you're there. A working knowledge of Congress is useful, and some respect for members of Congress is also important. A respect for the legislative process is important. But the fact of the matter is our Constitution sets up a system in which struggle is inevitable. They created a strong government, but to keep it from becoming too strong, they divided power up between three branches of the government and between two houses of Congress. And James Madison explained this by saying, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That whenever one branch of government, the president or the Congress, got too strong, the other branch would try to keep it in check. And so that struggle is it's a survival of the fittest, essentially, in the federal government, has gone on and will go on regardless of the personalities and the parties that exist there. Any number of factors, including the circumstances in which the president came to office, will determine the president's relations. It helps if the president's party controls Congress, but that's no guarantee. Eisenhower certainly had better working relations with Congress, was led by the opposition party, than Carter had with a Congress that was led by his own party. And presidents essentially have to play the legislative cards that are dealt to them. Now, Harry Truman was thrust into the presidency without warning or preparation at a critical moment in American history. He faced considerable obstacles in winning support from Congress, especially after his party lost the majorities in the 1946 elections. Truman deserves credit for building bipartisanship on foreign policy and for proposing substantial domestic legislation, even though the political circumstances prevented the passage of most of what he proposed. Barack Obama came to office at an equally difficult moment, but under more fortuitous political circumstances and with higher expectations. Like Harry Truman, Obama faced a hostile congressional majority halfway through his first term. Like Truman, Obama seems ready to run for re-election against a do-nothing Congress. That means we're right back where we started. Or, as Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. Thank you very much. Is there time for a few questions?
We have time for a few questions before Mr. Ritchie starts signing copies of his book, so come on up to the microphone.
Yes.
Question about how things might have changed against your narrative. It would seem that the public's business has become larger in scope and more complex by quite a bit since Truman's time. Is that a sense that you have, and how does it factor into your narrative?
The issues the issues that Truman faced were pretty complex as well. But yes, they have. And the interesting thing is that Congress is actually passing fewer bills these days, but they're bigger bills. To get something through Congress, you really have to pile everything into one bill, a popular bill that's going through that everybody will vote for and the president will sign. And so these days, a piece of legislation is a stack high. I did an interview with one of the pages who volunteered to stay behind during the Christmas break because Congress was voting on health care on Christmas Eve in 2009. And he got to the airport, and his suitcase weighed 56 pounds. And the airline said, you're 6 pounds over the limit. You have to pay $100 extra. And this poor kid, his face fell. It was Christmas Eve. The clerk felt sorry for him. And the clerk said, well, do you have anything in your suitcase that weighs 6 pounds you could take out and hold on your lap? And the kid said, opened it up, suitcase up, took out the health care bill. And his suitcase only weighed 49 pounds. So yes, things have gotten very complex, and that has certainly complicated matters. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted that so many of you came out. And happy President's Day.